Welcome, everybody. If you would put yourself on mute if you haven't already. And again, we'll probably have more arriving as we continue with the program. Welcome to February, our IHE third Thursday Lunch and Learn. Again, we're very excited that we are able to keep continuing this program. And it's one of the successes of COVID that by Zoom, we've been able to learn together. Today, we're very honored to have with us Dr. Jake Newsome. He is the manager of civic learning for campus communities at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He develops resources and programs to engage college and university students across the country with the history of the Holocaust through the lens of civic engagement. As part of his work at the USHMM, Dr. Newsome co-developed a program for college audiences that explored the histories of race and society in Nazi Germany and Jim Crow America. This presentation will offer insight into the design and outcomes of the USHMM's campus program, as well as the educational resources the museum has created on the topic. I was honored to meet and to hear Jake when I was at a program for centers like ours in the fall of 2019, and I know that you will enjoy hearing from him as much as I did. So I turn it over to you, Jake, and invite you to put yourself off mute.
All right, thanks, Scott, and thanks for the invitation to come speak with all of you today for your lunch and learn. This is Scott and I were just chatting before the program started about how there are a couple of silver linings of this whole COVID experience, one of which being that we have learned new ways to be able to communicate with and learn from each other. So I'm really excited to be here with y'all this afternoon. All of y'all are doing really important work around Holocaust education in your community. So it's great to be here and to share some of my experiences with all of you and to discuss them and also learn from you as well. So as Scott mentioned, I'm here today to talk about the experience that I had at the Holocaust Museum in DC back in the before times when we did stuff in person, where we developed a program for college and university students and professors looking at the history of race and racism, both in Nazi Germany, but also in the United States during the Jim Crow era. And so I wanted to be able to chat with y'all today about some of the key takeaways that we learned about how we can, or how you can rather, facilitate similar conversations with your community if you'd like. So I am going to share my screen. Let's see. All right. Well, now I've lost y'all, but that's okay. So you should be seeing my screen. Let me get it to full screen now. So what I thought that we would do today is just a quick overview of the agenda. First, I thought that it would be a great way to start getting into this topic just by sharing a little bit about what we did in terms of designing the program, implementing the program, and what some of the takeaways were. Then we will, I thought I'd share some of the examples of the historical content that really resonated with our audiences. And then we'll wrap up by showcasing some of the digital resources that our museum has created on this topic. And of course, we'll end with Q&A. But since we're a smaller group today, I thought that it's manageable, that you don't have to hold all of your questions or comments into the very end. After each of these kind of sections, I'll just pause and we'll discuss, or I'll try to answer any of the questions that you have. All right, so first, just a little bit about the program itself. This was back in 2016 to 2018. My colleagues and I at the museum were really looking to develop a program for college audiences And really, we were thinking both in terms of college students, but as well as their faculty, right? The professors on campus. We wanted to develop an initiative that would be able to engage these audiences for an extended period of time. So we were trying to get past kind of a series of one-off events on a particular topic, but how could we develop an initiative that brought people together into educational conversations over time? And so here you can see that some of our goals were, we wanted to kind of break out of the circle of audiences that the museum normally engaged. So we wanted different types of students, different types of professors, and different academic disciplines to engage with Holocaust history. But we really wanted to be able to enrich campus dialogue beyond just the classroom by using historical content that would provoke critical thinking about historical and contemporary anti-Semitism, racism, and violence. And of course, the primary goal of the museum was that in doing this and engaging new people in new ways, that we would help ensure that the history of the Holocaust was being studied and discussed and preserved on college campuses into the future. So the way we did these was, well, one of the ways we did these, we had kind of a multi-pronged strategy, was by organizing a series of panel discussions on campuses. We really looked at the Southeast. We had about 5 or 6 states that we were really focusing on. And we would organize these panels. Here's a couple of flyers as examples that specifically framed how we were going to be talking about this history, right? So we would invite scholars and experts, usually on the Holocaust, usually from either our own museum staff or from our network of scholars or partners, and then they would be on a panel, usually with an expert on some aspect of Jim Crow history, and those were normally from the host university, so that way the campus community could identify and find out who was a kind of an expert or a point of contact on the topic there in their community, so that after the program ended, they would still have someone that they could go to ask for whether it's more information, more resources on the topic. So we did a series of these panels over the course of 2 years, ranging on everything from religious life, as you could see here, to historical memory. We talked about photography of violence. We talked about different type of material symbolism, and looking at the role of ordinary people, for example, in racism in the United States or in Nazi Germany. And so while we used the kind of Nazism and Jim Crow umbrella theme, we would work with the local contacts there on the campus to find out what would be a topic that would particularly resonate with their community. And so, maybe there were certain topics or issues that were just particularly relevant in their own community at that particular time. And so we tried to find a historical example that would parallel or connect with that particular instance. So here you can see kind of a breakdown of the attendees of one of the events. This was a 2-day conference at the University of Alabama in Birmingham that happened in February of 2018, in which we kind of brought together all of those people who had participated in one of those panel discussions over the previous 2 years. We then brought them together for a 2-day conference. We called it a community symposium in Birmingham over those 2 days. And so one of our goals was really we wanted to, as I said, reach new audiences and diverse audiences. And so you can just see here that we had a really good breakdown of a lot of undergraduate students. But I'm not sure if you can see my mouse if I'm sharing it, but we had community members. Almost 20% of our attendees were unaffiliated with the university. And so, we thought that was, we hadn't identified that as one of our primary goals, but it was a surprising outcome that this was a topic that was of interest beyond, the classroom, beyond just the campus. Here, down on the bottom right, this was one that I really found enlightening and in some cases puzzling. These are the academic disciplines of the attendees who came to the event. And of course, we expected to see history, political science, but then healthcare management is really well represented, medicine, biomedical engineering, international studies, criminal justice, social work, philosophy, languages, and of course, even right here, you can kind of see a little bit smaller Holocaust and genocide studies. And so this was clearly a topic that resonated beyond kind of what we thought as the typical humanities audiences. So that was something that we were really excited about.
Dr. Newsome,
Yes.
would you mind explaining how a word cloud works for those of us who think we know, but maybe not? Like the words get bigger, right? The more they're represented.
Yes, so great question.
Thank you.
So essentially what we would do is, when the audience, or sorry, when the individuals registered for the event, we would ask them, what's your major? And so then what we would do is take those answers and put it into a word cloud. And so essentially, the more time a particular word, or in this case, a major, the more it appears, the bigger the word gets. So you can see, right, that there's a lot of different types of majors represented here, but the words that are bigger mean that they have essentially more votes, right? More people who have majored in that. So a lot of folks in history and political science and education, but then the next one is healthcare management, which is just which was really surprising to us. Yeah, no, thanks for asking. That was a good clarification. All right,
You are welcome.
These are just some of our university partners that we worked with for this initiative. And the reason I wanted to show this is because it's a pretty good range of, really large regional, comprehensive universities, state universities, down to, smaller research institutions, as well as at least one HBCU that we were able to work with there in Birmingham. And so these are representative of what we tried to do, was not only as a institution form individual relationships with each of these universities, but we really tried to foster a network of collaboration amongst the universities themselves. And so now we are almost 4 years out, and we know that at least some of those are still working together with each other on related programming. What we've seen is that, of course, this was before COVID, but the geographic proximity really was key to if and how those relationships continued into the future. And so, of course, the universities and organizations in Birmingham have continued to work really closely together, maybe less so with those across state lines. And so now I did just want to share really 3 key points from our experience with this program that really would be, I think, helpful or beneficial if you are thinking of facilitating one of these types of conversations with your audiences. And the first from our takeaways is the intentionality behind framing the conversation. When we first started kind of piloting this idea of doing a program on Nazism and Jim Crow, there was a lot of healthy skepticism about, could this work, right? Or was it going to sink, inadvertently into a comparison of suffering? If we tried to say that, let's just look at these 2 really traumatic histories, and is it just going to become as one worse than the other? And so we of course knew that we didn't want that to happen, because number one, that's not what we wanted to do. That wasn't our intention. But also that's not a productive conversation, right? We wanted to be able to really frame this in a way so that participants knew why we were addressing these 2 histories together. And we found that in order to do that, we had to put some kind of clear parameters on the conversation. One of those was surprisingly a clear timeline. And so we found, kind of with audience testing, we tried the word Holocaust, Nazi Germany, the final solution. And so what we ended up settling on was Nazi Germany, because all of the different events that we've done, we kind of stuck between 1933 to 1939. So before the outbreak of World War II, and definitely before the start of the final solution, because the historical research that we did lent us to the conclusion that once the final solution was implemented in Europe, really the productive parallels between these two histories kind of broke down. And so where we found where there was more area for, again, this meaningful conversation was in that those early stages from 1933 to 1939. So you can see that we tried to mirror that in our, even the way we named it and the way we framed it. And then the second one, the second point really builds off of that is, why do a program like this at all? Why, there's plenty of lessons to be learned from the Holocaust, just looking at the Holocaust, itself. There's plenty of lessons to learn from American history. So what is it that we hoped to gain by putting these two histories in conversation with each other? And this is really where it got down kind of to the crux of it. And we, practice always makes things better. And so really by the end of our programming, we felt that we were getting into a pretty good flow where we were really wanting our participants to take a deep dive into these two histories so that they could learn how and when and why do ordinary people become involved in systems of racism or even racist violence. And by looking at these two historical periods, we were really able to learn that racism is not, or anti-Semitism rather, is not just something that happens on a continent far away, but that racism, while it might look different, while there might be some differences, that there clearly are some similarities in how racism can infiltrate everyday society, so that it's not, we wanted to move beyond just looking at the kind of top tier leaders in these histories. And so we found really that the most productive conversations came when we really zoomed in and looked at particular case studies from these two histories, especially when we looked at so-called ordinary people, the everyday citizens. And so that I mentioned the 2-day conference that we had in Birmingham. For that, we actually, you can see the flyer for it here, just made the entire thing about bystanders and complicity, the role of ordinary people in during these two periods. And so, what came out, oh, sorry, yes, I do want to share just outcomes really quick before we pause for our first break. So you can see here that some of our outcomes is that we engaged well over 1,500 students, faculty, and local community members at 11 different universities in 5 states from almost 40 different academic disciplines over the course of the event. These were a lot of organizations or students who might not have otherwise engaged with the history, but also not engaged with each other as well. So through, we, of course, our primary goal is to, history education. So that, we did pre and post surveys and different types of evaluation. And we know that participants did learn more history of these two periods. But what we really wanted to be able to do is model how can you facilitate these types of conversations respectfully and accurately, right? One of the things that I actually meant to mention on the previous slide was when we were thinking of how to talk about these two histories together, is that, of course, we wanted to pay respect to both histories individually, right? And so how could we continue to do that and recognize the unique nature of each one while pulling out some of those similarities across time and space. And this was, I just wanted to share one story that exemplified in my mind some of the new understandings that have come from these types of cross-historical conversations. And so here you see a couple of students from Miles College, which is the historically Black college there in Birmingham, Alabama. And they participated in the Jim Crow South and Nazism program. And here on the left, you see the student talking about, and students are just incredibly blunt sometimes, right? They're just very honest, which is always refreshing. And he began his talk by stating that he wasn't really sure why he was assigned to read Elie Wiesel's Night in a class on racism. And actually, I think that his class was called Global Racism. And he wasn't even sure why he was learning about the Holocaust in a class on racism. And so later in the semester, the class took a field trip to Washington, D.C., where they came to our Holocaust Museum. And he said that going through the permanent exhibit was where, even though he had already read Night, it was not until he was in the exhibit and looking at the different artifacts and seeing the history kind of from a more of a zoomed out, higher level perspective, that he started to understand that how the Nazis had racialized anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism and racism can be connected. Because he said that up until that point, he had only thought that racism was an American problem and that racism meant Black against white or a Black and white issue. And so he was learning that, wow, okay, in his perspective, white people could be racist towards each other, right, through these different types of manifestations of anti-Semitism, for example. And so by the end, right, he had completely reprocessed how he understood racism and anti-Semitism. And so really, by bringing these two histories together, he was able to not only make a new learnings himself, but also then be able to share those with his fellow students when he went back to Miles College in Birmingham. And so here, just a couple more examples of some of the takeaways from the two-day event in Birmingham that we did in 2018. So here you can see a quote from one of the student participants who, she came from an African-American family. She wanted to come to learn more about the Jim Crow history, but of course, while she was there, ended up learning more about Holocaust history. So now she's saying, okay, I'm energized and motivated to go back and learn more about Holocaust history as well. Of course, then it also works the other way. So this was an attendee who had actually driven from Birmingham from Georgia, who came to learn more about the Holocaust, but then being able to learn about how racism looked and functioned in a place where he grew up, also helped reinforce the historical lessons of the Holocaust for him as well. And so we saw this kind of cross-pollination of when you see how some processes are different, but also similar in different parts of the world, it actually just enforces one's learning and understanding, as well as opening up new areas for learning together. And then the last outcome that I want to mention is probably my favorite, is that all of these events, we brought in leading scholars on the topic. It was very in some cases academic, right, to be able to get into the details of this history. But one of the things, as we tried to do, especially by the end, was bring in community members. How does this impact us beyond a history book? And so one of the things that we witnessed along the way, right, is that this, for a lot of people, this isn't just history. that this, the legacies of racism and anti-Semitism continue to shape how we live our lives today. And so that this was not just an academic exercise for people. This was a way to better understand their own selves, but also how they fit into history and the world. And so one of our kind of capstone events was an event where we brought together a Holocaust survivor. You can see Ms. Hirsch here on the left, and on the right, Mrs. Josephine Bowling McCall, who grew up in the segregated South, and unfortunately witnessed her father being lynched. And so we had these two really powerful women in a conversation with each other about what is it could they learn from each other and from that experience of dealing with the continued memory of these really traumatic histories in having those in their past. And the two had lived in Birmingham for decades, but had never met each other. And now, as far as I know, even through COVID, are continuing to be pen pals and call each other. And so while we're dealing with these really heavy histories, it does have the power to bring people and communities together. So I do, before I move on to kind of the historical case studies, I just want to pause and give anyone a chance to ask a question or make a comment if you'd like.
Please feel free to take yourself off mute.
I'm going to stop sharing my
question.
screen just for a moment so I can see everybody. Okay.
Great. Steve, I heard you.
I'd like to ask the doctor if there was any coincidence that this conference was held in Birmingham, since effectively Birmingham was probably the epicenter of Jim Crow South.
No, that very much was a factor in our discussions, and in our planning. And so we, the museum has a longstanding working relationship with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And so we were able to work with them. There was a new organization at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, called the Institute for Human Rights. It was a relatively new kind of office on campus that includes Holocaust education in their curriculum. And so we were really able to become a part of a network of educators that were already doing really wonderful work on this topic. But we were kind of able to just to bring everyone together into the same room to have the conversations together. But we really wanted, yeah, Stephen, to your point, sorry, we wanted to be able to have that, the local connection to the history that we were discussing.
I did a little over 2 years of training, and we lived in Birmingham, and quite honestly, I wasn't aware of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute.
They're a really great organization. There's a lot of different types of organizations in Birmingham that are doing, doing civil rights work. But it is, if you do get a chance to check out their website, or if you're back in Birmingham to visit their building, they have a really great exhibit there.
Oh, that's very interesting. Do they work with the Jewish Federation of Birmingham?
I'm not sure. Because I just know how we've worked with them together in the past, but I'm not sure what other partnerships or relationships that they have there.
The head of the Birmingham Jewish Federation is from Omaha. So
Wow.
I think there could be some collaborative effort. Danny Cohn, have Danny Cohn see if he's working with these organizations. I find that actually very interesting. I'm in Birmingham once a year. When was the Institute for Human Rights established at UAB?
I would say it's been in the last, well, now COVID. So let's just say add 2 years on everything. So probably seven years or so. 7 to 10 years, perhaps.
And do they have a distinct location within the campus?
Yeah, they do have their own, office space that has a classroom, like a small reading room, and then their offices for the staff that lead the institute. I can send out a link. I'll share it with Scott, who can share with everyone who's here today.
Yeah, I don't know what Scott thinks about getting some collaboration between the Jewish Federation there and these other organizations. I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm actually very excited to hear what you're telling us.
I'm excited to always try any type of new programming. And having Danny have been one of my former students, I'd be very happy to see what we could do in the future.
Great.
Anyone else have a question for Dr. Newsome before I jump in? Because I always have a question. I'm doing my teacher wait time. Okay, good. Here I come. You talked a lot, many times over about this difference between comparison and parallels.
Mm-hmm.
This is hard thing for me to explain. I think I get it in my own mind, but could you just talk a little bit about how you explain that to people?
I will try. I will not say that it was always successful, because in some participants' mind, really the critics' mind, because this I won't say that this was 100% well received and just universally loved by everyone who came or who saw it advertised. I think that for some folks, particularly I would say folks who have a direct family connection to it, whether it's the children of survivors, or on the other end, someone whose family did experience the violence of lynching, for example, just felt like this is something that is so unique that if you can call it compare and contrast, you can call it parallels, you can call it whatever you want to, but we just shouldn't be doing this together. So I will say that there was always that kind of component to it as well. But I will say that as we got into these events, I feel like it was more of the content itself that explained what we were trying to do better than I could, right? Or not just me, anyone who was doing the facilitation. We always started it with a very direct kind of, we are talking about these two histories together. Again, not to equate. I think is trying to get folks to understand that you can compare and contrast, because that's how we learn. We do that on a daily basis, right? By finding new information and comparing it and contrasting it with information that we already know. But to compare or to look at, to analyze, does not mean to equate. And I think that is, we would make that clear, or at least as clear as we could. And then once we started getting into the content and hearing from these experts that were saying that I think spent just as much time talking about the differences as the similarities, then kind of drove that point home that, okay, great, we're not saying that Jim Crow is just like Nazi Germany, but hey, when you're looking at these similarities, that is pretty interesting, and that helps us understand that no matter language or geography, certain types of, whether it's policies or mindsets or propaganda, can turn people against each other based on these ideas of race or anti-Semitism. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I took 3 sticky notes worth of notes. Thank you very much.
Great. So I will say, if we've got another question, we have time, but the next section is actually looking at some of those kind of historical examples that we used. And so that might help answer some questions about what does this actually look like? Oh, great. So let me share my screen again. right, so I will say that so a lot of the information that we used for this initiative came out of the museum's Americans in the Holocaust initiative, right? Well, I keep saying new, but it's several years old by this point. But it uncovered, a lot of information about what Americans knew about the Holocaust and what they were doing about it, how they were reacting. And so you can access an online version of the exhibit here at the link that you see on your screen. But as we were researching for this exhibit, we did find, some information that we could use for this particular campus outreach initiative. Why is it not 40? Okay. So one of the examples that we used as we were talking, with different students is that it's not just us now 80 years after the fact, looking back and kind of being able to say with hindsight that, oh, here were some similarities, here were some differences, but there actually were some quite direct connections between Nazism and Jim Crow policymakers in the United States, and that some of these ideologies, crossed these national boundaries. And so one of the examples that we used is the German-American Bund. And so, right, this was this pro-Nazi organization that was formed in the United States in 1936, if I'm not mistaken, that ultimately had somewhere around 25,000 members in the United States. And so it honestly wasn't a really huge organization, but still 25,000 people in the United States that actively supported the Nazi government in Germany and sought to establish some type of similar political organization here in the United States. And so this is a picture from a rally that the German-American Bund had at the Madison Square Garden in New York City here in February 1939. And you can see it's not a completely packed house, but clearly there's quite a few supporters there. And you can't quite tell, because I think this is a little bit of a grainy image, but there's a picture of George Washington up on the stage, glorified in a very kind of imagery reminiscent of Nazi pageantry in Germany. And so for a lot of students, they had no idea, right, that number one, that maybe Americans even paid attention to what was going on in Nazi Germany at the time, but that there were clearly enough Americans who were not only paying attention, but supported the type of racial and anti-Semitic policies that Nazi Germany was putting forward, that they formed their own pro-Nazi organization here in the United States. And so this type of case study really allows for a lot of conversation about what did Nazism look like in the United States. We just kind of only think about the segregated water fountains or segregated benches, but to see that there were some who kind of took it to the next step also creates meaningful conversation. Second would be looking at how did African Americans respond to Nazism specifically in the United States. And of course, just like today, Black people aren't all the same. And so there's a myriad ways that they responded to and reacted to Nazism. One of those being, that they took up arms and fought for the United States against Nazi Germany. Here you can see a really kind of powerful image of a Black soldier holding guard over Nazi German prisoners of war. But of course, this brought up a lot of discussion about what does it mean to fight for democracy and freedom abroad when your own army is segregated by race, for example. And so when you go off and fight for like, as I said, legal equality abroad, but then have to come home to a network or a system of Jim Crow era policies, which then brought us to one of a really interesting artifact that we uncovered in our research. Was a series of political cartoons that were drawn and published in the African American press. And so this one was published in the Pittsburgh Courier in April of 1938. So this is even before Kristallnacht, and it's called Strange Interlude. And so this is, by this point, a lot of Jewish people are seeking to flee Nazi Germany. And we have here a political cartoon of Uncle Sam standing at the house of the United States. You can see it says here, Land of the Free on the door. But the doormat, the welcome mat says, welcome to white aliens. You can see here, of course, they have a depiction of Hitler driving out refugees, but behind Uncle Sam's back is depiction of a slave. And you can see the words disenfranchisement, ostracism, and discrimination. So again, this is in 1938, widely distributed across an African-American readership. Usually the African-American press wasn't read by white Americans. It was open, white Americans could, but not a lot of them did. And so the viewers of this type of cartoon would have been primarily an African-American audience. So this is, as I said, in 1938. By 1942, the same newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, launched what became known as the Double V campaign, right, which was promoting victory against fascism abroad, but also victory against racism here in the United States. So for African Americans, one of the ways they responded was being able to put their own struggles in a much larger global context to say, what are we doing, an ocean away when we have what they saw as similar issues happening here in the United States? And is Uncle Sam, is the United States going to kind of live up to these ideals that we just fought for abroad back here in the homeland? So another example of African American responses is this poem by Langston Hughes from 1943. At that time, there were a series of, I would say, racially inspired or instigated riots here in the United States, including in Beaumont and in Detroit. And so Langston Hughes titled this poem From Beaumont to Detroit in 1943. And I'm just going to read it very quickly for you, because I know you can see it on the screen, but to read it through it together, I think is a really good way to kind of get the gist of it. So he says, looky here, America, what you done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now you're policemen, let the mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must have been in Beaumont that he had his start. Because everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right now, this very hour. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy. Then why don't democracy include me? I ask you this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. And so again, this is a really powerful artifact to be able to bring to students or community members, learners, right, in these events, where it really drives home the fact that these aren't issues that we are just simply looking at today after the fact, but that people living in the moment were struggling with these international conflicts, and what does it mean to fight different forms of racism and anti-Semitism, at home and abroad, and just to hear from the words of someone like Langston Hughes, it just says it much more eloquently than anyone else could today. So I do want to just show one more slide. I think I've got to go backwards. Is that it wasn't just Americans or African Americans here in the United States who were thinking about these different types of connections in an international context. The Germans were also thinking about it. And so here you can see an example of a flyer that the Nazis, a propaganda flyer that the Nazis actually dropped over American soldiers during the war, seeking to get African Americans to desert the US Army and come fight for the Nazis. And I won't read the entire thing, but the gist is the Nazi Germans understood that there were racial tensions and racist policies in the United States that subjugated African Americans. And so essentially they were saying, we don't subjugate African Americans in our country. We don't subjugate Black people in our country. So, we're not racist over here. So how about you lay down your arms, quit fighting for this country that subjugates you, and come over to fight for us. Of course, that's complete a complete fantasy, but right, it is an example that this history, this American history of racism, was also something that the Nazi Germans understood and tried to weaponize through propaganda against African American soldiers. So again, I just want to take a moment to pause before I share resources at the very end, but to answer any questions. I'll leave my screen up in case we want to discuss any of the.
I have a question about the poem. I found it interesting that some term, that the names Hitler, Ku Klux Klan in the body of the poem Jim Crow are not capitalized, but at the end they are. Is there any thought to that? I realize you're not a poet, but
no, that's a good question, and one that I asked some of my colleagues. Unfortunately, we're all historians, so we at least recognized it, but don't have an answer to that. I would, if you do find out one day, I would love to know.
I have a thought.
Sure.
Because my dad is a poet, so I know about this much more than you do. I'm pretty sure this has to do with something called prosody, where you purposefully use space and line length and capitalization and punctuation, or lack thereof, to underscore what you're trying to say. Right? So if everything Hitler, Ku Klux Klan, the things that are capitalized for a reason, and the things that are not are all supposed to be, I think, kind of parallel in importance.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the capitalization at the end, I think, is to make it jump out at you. That's just my uneducated poet proximity thought to that.
Makes sense to me.
I would like to add, it's been a while since I've read about this, so some of my memory is a bit foggy about detail, but I don't think this phenomenon of how the African Americans were so poorly treated was just an American phenomenon. I think the same thing occurred in Europe. You had large numbers of Africans who fought for European countries, for example, France, and they ran into very, very significant troubles, both during the war and after the war. So this is not just an American phenomenon. This was a race phenomenon, and I'd like to emphasize that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this type of program certainly could have been, it could be expanded to have a global lens to look at, for example, how did the institution of race-based slavery in Europe, for example, differ from that in the United States? What did did Hitler and leading Nazis take kind of some cues or ideologies from other imperial European powers? And the answer is yes, right? I mean, so I think that you definitely could kind of replicate this model of comparing but not equating two histories with other other historical contexts as well, for sure. I think that one of the reasons we looked at Americas, right? So these were going to be, we were engaging with American audiences, but also at the same time, and this is just, I guess, a little bit of kind of background behind the scenes, but as we were getting ready to plan and do our very first event in 2016, we really were wondering to ourselves, is it gonna work? Are people gonna find it relevant? And then Charlottesville happened, right? Where, there were people marching, with swastikas and the Confederate flag and chanting, Jews won't replace. So suddenly, we didn't have to bring these two histories together. It was on display, right, in the national consciousness. And we had, I think our first event was maybe 10 days after that. And so then we were extra worried that, is this going to be inflammatory at this time? And we found that, we luckily didn't have any type of disruptions, during one of the events. But surely it was on a lot of people's minds. We were trying to wonder if we were going to have to make it relevant, but clearly it was. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
So have you updated this program since 2016 to include the last 5 years and even now? I think this is a really interesting project now you're bringing it into college. I actually wondered about why it wasn't for high school.
So those are really great questions. So to answer the first one, we haven't updated this particular, we call it a regional initiative. So it kind of wrapped up in 2018. I will say we do constantly update the digital resources that now live on our website. But my colleague is now heading a new regional initiative in the Pacific Northwest. And it looks at the history of citizenship and how that was taken away or given based on racial lines, especially with the Japanese internment and with Native American removal. And so the idea is that kind of every 3 to 4 years, it will move to a different region and really focus on a history that is more closely related to that geographical region. And so right now, as I said, it's in the Pacific Northwest. It's all digital, of course, during this, the COVID pandemic. I will say, it's because why we did it in colleges and not high schools is it was born in our the team that runs college outreach. And so that's the funding we had. And then that's, that was the audience that we were kind of married to. But we have since then began working with our other teams that do high school education. And so there are a couple of lesson plans now for use in high school. Just because of staffing limitations, we don't have the capacity to go and do more of these types of in-person programs in high schools, but we are training high school teachers to be able to use these same lessons, but also artifacts with their students in their classroom. So great, thanks for that question. Marty, I see you have his hand raised. Oh, I think you're still muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Going back, I think it's fascinating that you are doing it. I was going to ask, and you've addressed it, different regions of the country, how you were addressing it differently in different regions of the country. Of course, I want it where my grandchildren are, and I want it right here. Now, but But going back to the historical context, I wondered if you had any information on the responses of the African-American population here to the German recruitment efforts.
Oh, that is good. That's a good, so I don't off the top of my head. But that is a really good question. I'm going to jot that down, and if I find anything, I'll send it to Scott to share. But that's a really good question that I just don't know the answer to. But Darlene, I saw your hand go up.
And what it would be like for them once they got there if they did respond.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, you know, the very first time that, and I guess I'm late to this, but the first time that I realized that Hitler based his laws on how to treat Jews was based on American written laws in the South on how to treat Black people. And I learned this in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, and she documented, you know, completely documented all of her resources, but I wasn't aware of that. And that happened in the middle 30s, early 30s. So there was a real connection there. I don't know if Langston Hughes knew that in 1943, but I was shocked. I didn't know.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button for a second. No, it is very thanks for that, Darlene. It is shocking to find out that, again, these aren't just kind of maybe some abstract connections, but that they're very direct, concrete connections in Cass. But also there's another book called Hitler's American Model, and I think the guy who wrote it is I am completely blanking on his name right now, but you can look it up. It's called Hitler's American Model. And it's written by a legal historian at Yale. It's a really short book, really easy to read. James something, I'm sorry, I'll think of it. But he was able to really document this idea or the fact that as the Nazis were developing the Nuremberg race laws, they did actually send a contingent of lawyers on an ocean liner to New York City to meet with American lawyers to discuss how and why these types of Jim Crow racist laws worked or didn't work. And this author actually makes a pretty compelling argument, but a surprising argument, that for the Nazis, they believed that the Jim Crow law specifically might not be the best fit in their own context. But what they did find really compelling, that they did almost kind of copy and paste into their own legal system, was America's race-based immigration laws and the laws prohibiting so-called interracial marriage. And so they found that, you know, some of the Jim Crow stuff was too specific to be able to, because right, and so they thought that they couldn't be able to apply it to the German context as easily, but then they were able to find some of these national laws and apply into the Nuremberg race laws. And so, I mean, there are all of these historical documents of Nazis that have, I mean, just notebooks full of legal research that they've done on the United States in order to shape their own racial policies. And more so, I think, in terms of rhetoric, the Nazis also knew that all of this kind of, I don't want to use the word propaganda, all of this messaging coming out of the United States about, you know, the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies, they could then turn around and just point to those types of Jim Crow policies as a way to say, you know, don't criticize our country until you've taken care of your own country. And so they did find that to be quite effective. Whitman, James Whitman is his name, the American Model author.
Before you give us our resources, I'm not sure quite how to phrase this question. What conclusions are you hoping people take away?
I personally hope, right, that they come away with, number one, a new understanding of how the Holocaust happened. Right, that this was it started with words, and that it was this, you know, incremental process of dehumanization, and that ordinary people played a big role in it. I also want them to know by you know, by putting this history into conversation with American history, is that it's not a unique German phenomenon. Right? That I think it's easy to study the Holocaust and say, well, it happened over there with some people a long time ago. It was bad. I'm going to try to take some lessons away, but it still kind of feels removed. But as soon as you know, bring one's own history into it, where you have a connection to it, that's why we, you know, went to the South, to Steve's question, you know, why we went to Birmingham, because these were people who would have a family connection to this history in one way or the other. And so in those same ways that we wanted to open up conversations about what does racism look like, what does anti-Semitism look like, we wanted people to also think about it here in their own history and their own connection to themselves, and see how, again, how ordinary people either put up with it or simply didn't do anything to oppose it, and how those inactions can add up to lead to, you know, it might be a final solution in one national context, but or it could be a, you know, racially segregated society that lasts for 400 years in another context. And so even though these histories led to two different outcomes, there is that commonality of ordinary people taking in their context and making decisions based on what are they going to do about it. And I think that that's what we really hoped that people would take away, is just thinking about their own roles and responsibilities in society today.
Thank you. This is, we talk about this a lot, about making the connections, right? That we've discovered people don't know the history. We don't know our own history. We don't know Holocaust history. So to learn the histories, to make the connections. Otherwise, we're just learning and saying the things, right? Saying the words. Got to know this stuff, or history repeats itself.
Exactly.
And what we're finding is that was step one.
Yeah.
Right. And now we have the rest of the steps to go through to try to help that future possible, where these things don't happen and keep happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So what I will do now is I just wanted to highlight a few educational resources that all of you will have, you know, available to you. We have, oops, let me get back over here to this screen, made them all very easily available on our website. If you just go to ushmm.org/Nazism-and-Jim-Crow. And so actually, you know, what I would like to do is actually get out of this PowerPoint and just go to the website. So I think you should be able to see, right, the website. Okay, yep. Great. So you'll see here that we've provided some, you know, kind of overview information, kind of historical essay type intro into the topic. But then you'll see that we have broken down all these resources by the type of resource that it is. And so I think, Gary, you had mentioned about high schools. And so here are a couple of lesson plans that are designed to teach at the high school level. We actually have a third one that will be uploaded, I would say, by the end of this month. But here we have one on racial science, you know, the pseudoscience of racism and eugenics, both in the US and Nazi Germany. We have one on the Nazi Olympics that talks about, you know, the 1936 Olympics, where there was a big push to have African Americans boycott the Olympics because they didn't want to go and support Nazi Germany. We do have one example syllabus. This was more based for a college level classroom, but really examples of readings and assignments that could be facilitated over the course of a semester for the college audiences. And then we have here, this is one of the things that I worked on more closely is researching and authoring a series of articles on the topic for our online Holocaust encyclopedia. And so the three first ones, I think, are probably the most directly related to the topic. And so, for example, they're all designed as discussion questions rather than saying, here are all the answers. We've posed them as questions and tried to link to areas that would, people could go for further reading. But one of them is, what actually were some of the similarities? My internet's running a little slow. What were some of the similarities between racism and Nazism in the US and Germany? And so, this is just, you can see we've, everything that we've learned from the research is just laid out here in background, all the way down. In what ways did racism in Nazi Germany look the same? Where were they different? And then, of course, linked to related articles to learn more. And so there are three. Why am I not getting to it? There are three of these discussion questions related to the topic there in the encyclopedia. But we also have a full bibliography on the topic. And then we have links to some primary sources that actually were authored or created by other institutions, like the Smithsonian, the National Museum for African American History and Culture, that allow students to be able to look at some of the primary sources on the topic. And then we also have some videos, including, this is what I'm excited about, including the discussion between Ms. Riva Hirsch and Josephine Bowling McCall that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Well, again, my internet is going pretty slow, so I'm going to just close that. But this was the conversation between the Holocaust survivor and the woman whose father was lynched in Alabama. And so it's about an hour long, and it's really a moving video to be able to watch. So all of this is, again, here available to you on our website. There was another tool. Again, this is linked on the website, but I wanted to show just a little bit more in depth. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the museum's online teaching tool called Experiencing History, but it makes primary source documents available to, well, it used to be just for college and university classrooms, but now it's open and available to anyone. You don't have to sign up and use a university email anymore. But we have several different collections where we've brought the different artifacts together by theme. And one of them is on Americans and the Holocaust. And within that Americans collection, there is a module on African Americans in World War II. And so this, if my internet goes quickly enough, here you can see like another one of these really great introductory essays with footnotes and hyperlinks for getting that. If you feel like you don't have enough of a historical foundation to be able to talk about or facilitate a conversation on these topics, here's a really great essay for you. And then at the bottom is, I think it's up to 15 items now on the topic. And so ranging everything from newspaper articles, oral history testimonies. We see some more of the political cartoons like the ones I showed earlier. And here's the Langston Hughes poem that we walked through together earlier. And so each one, if you click on it, It will show you, the artifact itself or the document itself, and you can, zoom in. But then also has an introductory essay about that particular document itself, written by a scholar on the topic. And so this is just a really great way for educators or students or lifelong learners to, it's as close as they can get to being in an archive looking at these documents without actually having to go to an archive to look at the documents.
Dr. Newsome, is this Experiencing Holocaust, the perspectives.ushmm.org available from the museum's landing page?
It is, it's kind of hard to find.
I was looking because Carol had asked for that link and I thought, oh, I'll just find it off the landing
So-
page. And that's what I found. I can't find it.
So if you just type in, and I'll drop it in the chat too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Experiencinghistory.com, it'll come up.
Okay. I used
So
to have
there.
the same problem with History Unfolded until I learned how to find it.
Yeah, part of the information is also on the landing page about some of the things that you just presented.
Yeah, so you definitely, so from that landing page of Nazism and Jim Crow, you'll be able to find, a link to this. But if you're just coming straight at it from the museum's main homepage, it is hard to find. So I do suggest once you get there, you can just bookmark it. That's what I have to do still, even as a staff member. And so, yeah, I just dropped that back into the chat.
Great,
And
thank
again,
you.
That'll take you to the main homepage and you'll see that there's a lot of different collections that are really interesting. Jewish perspectives on the Holocaust, of course, Americans, and then everyday choices, roles, motives, and choices during the Holocaust. And so within each of those, as I showed, there's a wide range of subtopics, including American college students' reactions to the Nazi threat. That's a relatively new one that we've created that is really, it resonates well with students here in America today. So that is the end of the presentation that I have, but I am more than happy to answer more questions or show you more, go deeper into any of these resources that I've showed you online. So I'll just open it up to the floor.
I have a question of my fellow Omahans. Did anyone notice in the paper when they publish about new state laws being introduced to the unicameral that they were going to have the Holocaust made as a permanent study?
Yes, I testified on Tuesday at the hearing. I'll be honest, it's very, very general. It says that you should teach about the Holocaust and other genocides. I spoke with Senator Day's office afterwards, and so did Ari Cohn, he and I together, to say that this is wonderful, this is a great start, but that you need to put something more behind this, meaning that just to say it, and exactly what we were all saying here, that just to have, in fact, I wrote it down to include why learning, just, why are you learning this history? And it doesn't go into any of that. And so it is a good start, but it really is the starting gate and nothing more at this point. I'm glad they're doing something. It probably will get passed this time, but it doesn't say much. It doesn't do much. One of the things we do is try to speak directly with teachers, provide them with resources, provide them with partnerships, and work with them so that they can develop the materials that they need.
Thank you for testifying, Scott. That's great, because even if it's just a start is good.
Yep, no, agreed, absolutely. And it was really very positive, and we'll see what happens.
Scott, this is Darlene. I somehow got linked to the World War II History Museum, and they have frequently have programs on Black servicemen, the Black South, Nazism, involved with World War II, and it's geared to students. In fact, I can't access some of it because I'm not in a classroom. That I find it interesting that they do a lot of education in that area.
What's the website?
It's the United States World War II Museum. But in order to access the stuff that's for classrooms, you have to give your school and your number of students and that sort of stuff to register. I do watch a lot of their programs, but some of that I can't watch. So, but it is interesting that it's there.
Yeah.
And probably every week. I don't know. Jake, do you know about that?
I have, we did speak with them back in 2016 when we were starting the program, but these online resources must be relatively new. I wasn't aware of those yet.
Well, I
So
think
thanks
I
for-
picked it up, during COVID, Zoom and COVID.
Yeah.
So I have seen a lot of really, really good archival programs, and they do speakers and that sort of thing. But the educational programs for whatever age students they're for, I can't access that.
Steve.
Dr. Newsome, tell us where the name Jim Crow came from.
So it was based on a, it's been a while since I've answered that question. I forgot exactly what year, but the early to late mid 1800s, a caricature of a really overly exaggerated African-American folk song, I guess is how you would frame it, where essentially it was white performers in blackface would go around performing, named after this character called Jim Crow. And so it was a very exaggerated, derogatory portrayal of African Americans, clearly performed for white audiences. And so as these laws were being implemented, it kind of then got attached with this, again, these caricatures of African Americans and African American culture, and the two kind of became synonymous. And so it was never kind of an official, it wasn't a real person, one thing, but it also wasn't kind of an official name of the policy, rather just more of a what do you call it? I guess a slang name for it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Newsome. This is absolutely amazing. And I know that we've just scratched the surface, and hopefully as we come out of COVID, at some point we can see if there's more that we can do together with this. Possibly you'd be interested in presenting this with the universities here, which also leads us to next month. We are going to have Dr. Ari Cohn from Lincoln, and he and Dr. Gerald Steinhacker are working as far as with Holocaust education, both the present and the future. And Ari is going to present on that. And I welcome everyone attending again next month. And again, I'd like to thank Jake for being here. This was unbelievably wonderful. And we'll see you all soon.
Great.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Dr. Newsome.
you
This
so
was
much.
great.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
was.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Really great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.